Hi there! Thanks for joining me for another video. Today we're going to be making this fun and glitzy birthday Make-A-Wish card. So I'm going to start out today with an A2 size panel of bubblegum pink cardstock. And I'm going to do some ink blending on top of this. So I have my bubblegum and my sweet berry ink pads, and then I also have these small daubers that go with each of these ink pads. Now as I got started with this, I realized that my bubblegum pink ink pad was actually a little bit dry, and then I hadn't used these daubers for a while, so the dauber itself was really dry. So it's taking a lot more ink to try and get that dauber to a point where it's blending really well, and because the ink pad's dry, there's not as much ink in it to pull up. So it does take me a while because I'm kind of fighting against those things to get the blending the way that I wanted. I didn't want to re-ink it while I was working on this card because then I was going to have a lot of really wet ink and it would wind up being kind of goopy. So I'm trying to work with what I've got at this moment, and it does eventually work for me. It's just taking a little bit more patience and a little more work. Now I'm going to switch over to the Sweet Berry ink. Now this one blends a lot easier. This is a very fun, kind of semi-bright pink, so it's going to add a nice little punch to what's going to be the bottom of the card. So I'm just blending that from the edge and then pulling it up, and I'm only going halfway up the card with my blending on this particular color. Once I get that edge to the color that I want, I'm just going to come back in with my bubble gum one more time. I'm going to blend out that edge where I blended the sweet berry to, and I'm just going to bring that up just a little bit just to make sure I get a nice fade into the cardstock color. Now I'm going to be doing some heat embossing on this, and because I want to make sure that the embossing powder doesn't stick to my background, I'm using my heat tool to make sure that this is really, really dry. Now this is really sped up. It did take me a while to make sure that this was really dry. And I'm going back and forth just to try and keep the cardstock more even. So I'm going to actually take some embossing powder and just sprinkle it on and try and see if it still sticks. And there was a little bit that was still sticking, so I'm going to go back and heat it a little bit longer just to make sure that it is completely dry. Now I'm taking my pan pastel in the colorless blender, and I'm just putting some of that all over the cardstock. Again, I'm using a background stamp on this. I want to make sure that the embossing powder only sticks to the stamped portion of the image and not through the whole piece of cardstock. So I'm going to go ahead and ink this. This is the Graduated Dots background stamp, and I'm inking it with the clear pigment ink. And I'm just going to lay my cardstock on the stamp. Now, I was showing you earlier that the dots are actually larger at the bottom and then they get smaller as you go up, at least the direction that I'm using it on this particular card front. So I want the bigger dots to be in the darker color. And I'm using my bone folder to make sure I get all of that cardstock pressed against that stamp. So I'm going to be using clear embossing powder and sparkle dust mixed together to make my own sparkling embossing powder on this. And I'm going to just sprinkle this all over this background and tap it off really well, and then get that other side covered. So now I'm going to heat set this. Because it's clear, sometimes it's a little bit harder to see, at least when you're the one doing it, to see where it's actually like getting completely melted. But you want to make sure that this gets completely melted all over the cardstock. And this is great because that clear embossing actually kind of traps the glitter pieces into the embossing, so it sheds a lot less than glitter that's just on top of glue on your card. So I'm taking a piece of whipped cream cardstock and I'm going to stamp that Make-A-Wish ATS stamp onto the cardstock, and I'm doing it at a little bit of an angle. You'll see, because we're going to die cut this, when we go to die cut that angle is actually going to help so that we're not cutting off too much of the stamp on the edges. I'm using the same coffee filter I used before. I just flipped it inside out so that I wouldn't get any of that sparkle in my rose gold embossing powder. And then I'm just going to go ahead and use my heat tool to melt that down to a shiny finish. I love that rose gold embossing powder. It's such a pretty color. So I pulled my platinum machine in. We're going to be using these treat label dies to die cut that sentiment out, and I'm using the third from the largest die in that set. I'm just kind of lining it up on my cardstock to make sure I cut off as little as possible on this sentiment. This sentiment is just a hair bigger than that particular die, but the next die up was just way too big for what I wanted. So go ahead and pass that through the die cut machine. So now I'm going to trim down my bubble gum panel. I'm just taking a 1/4 inch off of either side. So this is actually going to be a 4" by 5 1/4 inch panel once it's done. I like to save that till last because then if I hit my stamp on the cardstock a little off kilter, I can actually trim it down so it's straight. It's just easier to wait and trim that after you've stamped that background. So I decided to add some ribbon on here. I wanted a little bow. Using just a little Scotch tape to hold that ribbon onto the back side of the cardstock. I find I get a much tighter wrap around the card if I do that. For some reason, I have trouble when I'm doing bows and ribbon, and I cannot get it to tie tightly against the cardstock if I don't have it taped down somehow. So I'm going to play with this bow just a little bit. Because I'm using a satin ribbon, it is shiny on one side and matte on the other side. So I'm trying to get this to turn so that the shiny side is up. And it just takes a little bit of playing with and kind of rotating as you go. And I had removed a little bit of the Scotch tape so that I could actually shift that bow over a little closer to the edge of the card. And then I'm going to trim off the excess on the ribbon and add some foam squares to the back side of my sentiment panel. Just taking the backing off of those, and then I'm going to adhere that down so that that bow just kind of comes up over the bottom corner. I'm going to add more foam squares. I'm going to attach this to a whipped cream top folding A2 card base. And the final detail is going to be a few scattered pearls across the front of the card. I like to do these in odds, so I'm starting out with 3 in a cluster there, and I'm going to add 2 more, which makes the total on the pearls 5 on the card, so it's an odd number. And that's the card for today. There will be a supply list listed at my blog, which is in the description below. And I hope you enjoyed. Have a wonderful day. Much love to you all.